Thanks, Cheryl. So I am Dr. Teresa Fowler. I'm here at Concordia University of Edmonton, and I'm really privileged to be able to introduce Dr. Courtney Szto, who is an assistant professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's. She's published widely on racism in hockey, including her award-winning book, Changing on the Fly, Hockey Through the Voices of South Asian Canadians, and the publicly available policy paper on anti-racism in Canadian hockey. So thank you so much for joining us, Courtney, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much for having me. Let me just set up the screen share here. That's not the right screen. What about this screen? There we go. I think that's better. Yeah. So hello, friends. I see many names that I recognize in the participant list. I don't know why some of you are here. You've heard me speak many, many times, but hopefully there will be something new here for you as well. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the land of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee First Nations. And lacrosse being the gift from the creator to the Haudenosaunee in particular, was first introduced to non-Indigenous people in the 1840s. But by the 1880s, the colonizers had banned Indigenous teams from competing with non-Indigenous teams, and that ban lasted for 100 years. During the 1980s, the Iroquois Nationals were created as a way to not only reclaim their sport, but also to reassert their Indigenous sovereignty to the land. In 2022, they placed third at the World Championships, and last year at the World Championships, the team changed their jerseys from Iroquois, which you can see in the top right-hand picture is how their jerseys used to look. They now go under Haudenosaunee because the name Iroquois has a contentious history. It was a name given to the Haudenosaunee by their colonizers and was a French term connected to the idea of snake and murder. So they have reclaimed their name as the Haudenosaunee Nationals, which means people of the Longhouse. And I think this is one way that we can take land acknowledgements beyond just kind of the words, but to support Indigenous land sovereignty. And through sport, I think this is a good example of, supporting the team also is parallel with their Indigenous rights to Haudenosaunee land as well. So I'm gonna start you off with an activity. So I want you to put things in the chat. And I've run this activity with other hockey teams and athletic groups before, but I'd like you to think about what your ideal rink space could be. So you can think of it as a community rink, you can think of it as a stadium. And I want you to put in the chat what your ideal rink would have. What would it look like? What would it feel like? What would it sound like? Maybe what would it smell like? And think about the values that you would like to put into that space. How can you input those values into the physical space of that rink? Money is no object. So be as radical and think as big as you would like. And yeah, we'll just take a couple of minutes to see what folks put into the chat here. That the only thing people want is comfortable seats for fans. Do we have things coming into different areas? There we go. So we've got some in the Q&A, some in the chat. I'm not sure what folks can see on the webinar side, but we've got accessible, clean bathrooms, clean, I think perhaps being the operative word there. Clean, inclusive, accessible change rooms, a rink located beside every elementary school in Canada. That's cool. Large dressing rooms, places for kids to run around to do, excuse me, warm-ups, and team bonding. Ooh, a gear library. I like that idea. Free skate sharpening. Healthy options in the concession. Nice. Give you 20 more seconds to get any opinions that folks have in there. Okay. Free food programs, pre or post game. That's cool. Fireplace, nice little cafe. A rink where people are free to be themselves, knowing that there's a safe space for all. So that's kind of a general value. And I think as we'll go through, the question is really like, what does that actually look like in practical terms? Representation, so photos and images of diverse communities on the walls. Nice. And Christy, natural light. That's an interesting one. So when I did this with the PWHPA last year, some of the things that they came up with were childcare centers. Obviously, as women's hockey, that's kind of more important to them than perhaps men's hockey. Pet care centers, because so many of them have dogs. They wanted private chefs. I believe it was Hilary Nate and Jill Saunier's group that wanted a retractable roof. So maybe that's part of the natural light bit for Christy's suggestion. Some folks wanted speakers in the boards, a spike ball area, nursing rooms, and I believe this was for fans as well as players. A market for local businesses, a spa, free tape. A lot of them put free tape. I think this is a really big issue in women's hockey, that they don't have enough tape. One group wanted an ice rink on the roof. So they basically wanted their stadium to be part of a community center, and then like a public rink on the roof for people to use. Another group had said food with lots of dietary considerations as part of the concession. So gluten-free, dairy-free, vegan as well. Gender-neutral bathrooms. When I did this activity with Queen's Athletics a couple of weeks ago, the figure skaters, they wanted the boards gone because they don't need the boards, right? So why am I asking you to think about an ideal space when we're here to talk about anti-racism is really because space is political. Space is political because it is designed with particular humans in mind, and we design those spaces with values built into them, similar to like why the figure skaters don't need the boards. It's not actually for them in multi-purpose arenas. So they do kind of tend to be more for hockey players in Canada. I think that casinos are a space that have so much psychological thought put into them. It's kind of scary. So casinos have been very cleverly designed in a way that play on the weaknesses of human psychology to make sure that you spend as much time in there as possible. There was a 630-page book that was published in the 90s about how to design the best casinos. No clocks. You're not supposed to know what time it is, how long you've been gambling, no windows and no natural light, because again, then you have no sense of what time of day it is. They design them to be in a maze. You're supposed to have a hard time getting out of them to disorient people so that you get lost in the way. And then, oh, you spend some more money either at the casino or buying something. There are smaller rooms to give you a more kind of intimate feel, which is why you kind of have like groups of machines and games in separate areas as opposed to like kind of like an open concept. And slot machines are the decor. Like there's not space for decorations in casinos because there's no wasted space. Every space is supposed to be a place for you to gamble. When we had NAS there a couple of years ago, I think you could sit at the bar and there was like online gambling there so that when you're eating food or drinking, you could still gamble, right? This idea of like every surface that you touch is meant for one purpose. So when you feel tired, agitated, excited, think about what the space does to contribute to those feelings, right? Because this is part of that environment that create. And if we are thinking about like a lecture hall, for example, like what are the values of this room? Everybody's kind of facing one way. Students are passive consumers of information. It's one type of learning. You sit and you listen. Generally, our lecture halls have no natural light. We know that this is not good for learning. And so the same thing goes for the way that we design our sporting spaces, whether it's the stadium or a gym space. Our ideas of gender, class, ability, and race are built into these spaces. So when we have like a women's section in a gym and the heaviest dumbbell is about 15 pounds, we've designed the space with a particular gender ideology. And think about how people use the space of a weight room very differently from a studio space, which is like open to interpretation, right? Open for different kinds of movement and different kinds of training. So usually when we talk about anti-racism, most of our focus is about language, personal interaction, biases, and space is either the last consideration or not even a consideration at all, because we don't really think of it. Sometimes it's something that we can change because it's like it precedes us, or something that doesn't really matter. If anybody has seen the book Running While Black, there's a great excerpt in there where the author's name is escaping me right now, but she's talking about why she does not want to run the Boston Marathon, but she likes running the New York Marathon. And it's because the New York Marathon runs through all different boroughs and there's diverse communities, and she can see herself represented in where the race takes place. The Boston Marathon basically just runs through white parts of Boston. So even the way that the race is designed, she feels like it's an elitist race to begin with, and then the actual course reifies the whiteness of the competition. So as much as like language and programming is important, I think we have to realize in sports that people on teams change, right? There's a new crop of people that come in and we have to teach those values over and over again. But if we can design a space intentionally, the space itself can carry a lot of that labor from generation to next. So our spaces have historically been designed for white men. When women, racialized people, and people with disabilities are not in the architectural conversations, we end up with really long lines for the women's bathroom as one simple example, right? Or rinks where one of our most accomplished para hockey players, Billy Bridges, he had to traverse down 6 stairs to ice level in order to coach his daughter's team in Oakville. This was posted, I think, late 2022. So the design of a space is a physical manifestation of our values. And this one's just for fun. I don't think that the audio is going to play, but that's okay. We just want to see it. You might have seen this a
small town in Saskatchewan got the village about 200 there.
Dropped onto the map this week as players hit the ice. Lang, Saskatchewan dropped onto the map this week. Video that's raised eyebrows around the world. But in Lang, it's
a small town.
Stop playing. So I'm not sure if you could hear that, but the point is like that rink in Saskatchewan, they built it in the 1920s and it requires a drawbridge for players to get to ice level, right? So we can say that it's old and those are old values, but it is 2024. People are still using it. When the sport is already financially inaccessible, things like this make it even harder to say that hockey is for everyone when it becomes kind of a novelty to have that kind of space. And that's actually what the news piece is about. It's not necessarily about how poorly designed it is. It is about how everybody wants to play at that rink because the drawbridge is kind of fun and different. So we tend to think of space as something that is passive, it's just there, but as Henri Lefebvre contends, that space is, quote, itself the outcome of past actions. Social space is what permits fresh actions to occur while suggesting others and prohibiting yet others. So he kind of breaks down very simply the production of space into 3 different forms. Conceived would be kind of like the architectural, scientific design of it, how we understand a space through our knowledge. And this understanding comes from both knowledge and ideological dominance. So what people kind of envision a space is supposed to do. The perceived space is how we make sense of physical space with our senses. So how we kind of receive that material creation. And then lived is like the meaning that we attribute to space. What actually happens when you put people in that space, because it could be very different from what the original intentions were. So ableism is like one of those examples. It's far easier for us to see in physical space, but what does racism look like when we're talking about physical space? So I've just got a few examples here of kind of the racialization of space itself. Redlining is perhaps one of the most talked about examples, where historically in the United States, and there were practices in Canada where this happened as well, and do continue to actually, we demarcate neighborhoods that are desirable or declining based on race. The neighborhoods that are colored in red were least desirable, typically marked by where Jewish people or Black communities lived, and they were denied opportunities for housing loans. So if you can't get a housing loan, you can't buy property, you can't create generational wealth, you have nothing to pass down to people. So it is kind of like locking people into a particular class. And then we also see a lack of infrastructure investment in those spaces as well. Food apartheid, more commonly, you might have heard it as food deserts, but we try not to use that term because deserts are naturally occurring phenomenons. But where we decide to put grocery stores and community gardens, those are social choices that we make. So we're determining who has access to fresh food and who is subject to fast food, heavily processed food, and thus worse health conditions. So the space itself is kind of contributing to inequitable health outcomes. Gated communities, where we see white flight from kind of more urban areas, you can ensure that you're kind of only associating with people of your kind, and you're physically separated from the outside world. And then First Nations reserves is the displacement of Indigenous people from the land, corralling them into small parcels of land where they could not hunt or gather, and ensuring that Indigenous communities were no longer self-sufficient, right? So these are some of the big structural ways that we have historically racialized spaces themselves. In sports, we could also question where we invest in things like public pools, community centers, rinks, which were some of the things that came up when I asked you what your ideal rink would be, was sometimes the location of it. Historically, we've had racially segregated sporting spaces, and that's perhaps the most obvious form of racism, like whites only pools or bathrooms, largely marked by signage, but also the quality and effort put into a space, not dissimilar from having girls have to get changed in broom closets at rinks, right? Spaces that are clearly afterthoughts or good enough spaces. The Colored Hockey League is also a perfect example where they could only play on indoor rinks after the white teams had finished. So that speaks to ice quality, the time of day, and the length of their season. Native mascotry has been another way that we have created overtly racist sporting spaces. So things like the logos or the team chants that take place within a stadium, like the tomahawk chop, these reproduce racism in a particular space. In 2018, the city of Mississauga removed all of the native mascots from the city's athletic facilities. McGill, a few years ago, changed their team name from the Red Men, with Indigenous students arguing that having native mascotry at the school directly goes against the recruitment and retention of Indigenous students and athletes. And then Confederate flags are another example. The Rebels senior hockey team in Saskatchewan is planning to change the Confederate flag logo in their stadium when they can afford it. So this Confederate flag on the ice is still, to my knowledge, is still there. So some of these are, pretty recent examples. So we still have quite a ways to go when we're thinking about how do we make the space of the rink more anti-racist. So for the most part today, we're dealing with things kind of like environmental microaggressions as opposed to the outright segregation. So we can think of this as like death by 1,000 cuts. Environmental microaggressions means that the physical space can contribute to certain groups feeling invalidated, unwanted, or unsafe. So a perfect example would be that at Queen's University, all of the graduation photos on the walls of the departments speak to the white history and enrollment at Queen's. I had a student once realize that I think she was studying in the law building, and she looked around and she was like, all of the law school classes are just white students, right? And another student went to the Kingston Sports Hall of Fame at the Leon Center, and she's like, everybody is white in these pictures. So we could be like, well, were all the students who enrolled happened to be white? Were all the best athletes who played in Kingston, they just happened to be white? That could be one simple explanation of it, but also as we move forward, we have to think about how we challenge what happened in the past, right? Are we now seeing racialized professors teaching in those law classes? Are there racialized students in their classes with them to be like, yes, things are actually different? Are there racialized coaches and trainers working today that shows that things have changed if we're not necessarily talking just about the player pool? So things that can contribute to environmental microaggressions could be like music. What kind of music is being played in the locker room or the stadium? Who gets to control that music? A couple of years ago, I was on a panel with Soraya Tinker, and she said that the whitest thing she ever did in her hockey career was to pretend that she liked country music. So the ways that people kind of negotiate how they're going to fit in by liking things that the dominant ethos of the culture has kind of decided. I did a talk on Monday with Queen's Athletics, and a coach asked me about what happens if somebody starts playing music in the locker room by someone who has said racist things. And Morgan Wallen was specifically the example, that somebody who's been caught on tape saying, I believe it was the N-word, a terrible racist tirade, I think he went on, but is still at the top of the country charts. Like, he's all over the Spotify Hot Country playlist. And so what do you do in that instance? And we had discussions around that. And I think, one, it takes somebody to recognize who is singing, the controversy that went around it, and then a coach or a player being like, let's have a conversation. Does this speak to the values? What are we willing to, where are we willing to draw the line? And most of the athletes in the room said, there's so much music that we could choose from. Why does it have to be this person? Until they've kind of proven that they've created an amends, if possible. But I think that things like music offer coaches and teams a really good opportunity to discuss what the values of that space are, how the space is going to be taken up. Food, what is the food that is served at concessions, but also like team events when you're like buying food for teams, like pizza and sandwiches. Are we kind of doing the consistent thing? Are there ways that we can support local racialized caterers or restaurants? What holidays are being observed by the physical space? Are we always closed on Christmas, but we're, having other events that are going on Jewish holidays or something like that, right? Also, if you're the only racialized person in a space, that is a constant reminder that you are different. And so again, as we have less flexibility with the athlete recruitment from year to year, it's extra important that the support staff around teams are as diverse as possible, so that when players show up there, they know that they're not the only person in that space. Maybe they are on the team, but there is an equipment manager, an assistant coach, or people around them that they can kind of lean on. Naming practices would be another one. So who are things named after? And we're moving towards this thing where everybody's named after corporations. But we've had to make decisions around things like Ryerson University. But we also have issues in the physical spaces that we will take people to. So I'm going to use rock climbing as an example, because I learned about this from a colleague, Dr. Jennifer Wigglesworth at the University of Northern British Columbia. If anybody knows anything about rock climbing, the way that routes are named is that the first ascensionist, so the first person who gets to like summit that particular route, gets the privilege of naming the route. Unfortunately, there's a lot of folks who have taken this privilege and made some questionable choices with it. So I've got a QR code here, so folks can look at it on their phone, but I've also if I put this in the chat for the moderators, can you put it in for the rest of folks so that you can, I'll also pull it up on my screen here, but I think sometimes it's easier if folks can actually look at the document themselves. So let me see if I can switch screens here a little bit. Okay, so I think you should be able to see this Google document. So this is a Google Doc that grassroots rock climbing organizations have created, and you can see that this is mostly in Tennessee and the southern United States, but these exist in Ontario and in Canada. There are multiple Google Docs out there created by different groups. And so like the first route name on there, ethnic cleansing. Second one, gas chamber. Battered women. Strange fruit. If you're not familiar with that, it's the title of a Billie Holiday song from the 1930s, and Strange Fruit is in reference to lynchings, that she sings a line that, you know, that tree seems to be bearing strange fruit, and that somebody would actually then name a rock climbing route that is further marginalizing Black folks from outdoor spaces, right, in very structural ways. So as you kind of look down the list, I think what we need to notice is that these names are equally racist as they are misogynistic, as they are homophobic. So this is why we cannot fight racism independently. These are all intertwined structures, and this speaks to colonization and, you know, the power of the idea that land is something that we can own and we can do whatever we want with it. And I like to use this as an example of kind of the racialization of space and structural racism, because it doesn't matter how much programming you do, it doesn't matter how nice you are to people. You can take a very diverse group of youth out to a rock climbing crag and show up, and the people next to you are climbing the noose. You know, like, this is not a welcoming space. It is, exclusion is built into the space itself. So I think these are the things that we need to challenge collectively, and it's not about us individually trying to do something on our own. This is something that we have to organize around, just like these folks have done by putting together these Google Docs. And what was the other thing I was going to say about this one? And the other way that it is institutionalized is that, so somebody comes up with the name for the rock climbing route, and then the guidebook prints them over and over and over again. So the person comes up with the name, none of their friends are like, maybe that's not the name that you should assign. And then it goes to the guidebook, and the guidebook sees this, and they're like, okay, yeah, we're gonna print the rapist into the guidebook, and we keep printing it year after year after year, right? So these are the things where there has to be a change. There has to be someone that stands up in that room and says that, you know, we need to do things differently. Let me just try to get this back here. So we have to ask, what kind of space are we inviting people into? And this is, I've said this in a few different hockey talks, but I think growing the game is one thing, but at this point, I think we are inviting people into a violent space, which is not really fair. I don't think that we've done enough work internally to be like, okay, yes, come into this space. We can assure that it is going to be safe for you. So what does this all mean in kind of practical terms? I think an example is that my friend is a high performance tennis coach in BC, and she was recently at a tournament in Plantation, Florida. She told me where she was. I was just kind of like shocked. Where the kids are playing on an actual plantation. It's not surprising that this is where they have made huge tennis clubs. And I've read articles where Black people have had to go to plantations for events or weddings and things, and they some people have said that they're overcome with the sounds of the screams of their ancestors in those spaces. So for a tennis tournament to be like, okay, we're taking our kids to this particular tournament is extremely problematic. I had a student who works for Kayak Canada now, and they were trying to figure out how to avoid having their spring training in Florida because of the changing political stances on both racism, but also LGBTQ rights, right? They just didn't want to subject their athletes to going to a space that may not be safe. Ultimately, money dictated that they couldn't necessarily move it elsewhere, and they did the best that they could with the parameters that they had. But I think these are important considerations that teams and associations and organizers have to make. Like, where are you trying to physically take people? Have you done your homework? Are you ensuring their physical safety of the players and their families? The second thing I think we need to do is to do a good audit of your home rink. What does it look like? What values does it reproduce? Do a walk around. Is the signage clear? As is kind of a simple one. I think most hockey rinks are actually very poorly marked. Are there people who are available to greet new folks and answer questions when there is a new program starting? You know, like on those first couple of weeks, how can we be more supportive if the physical space is lacking? How can we make up for that? What is the imagery at the rink, which somebody commented earlier? Like, what does it look like? What are the trophies and pictures reproducing? Where do people sit during games and practices? Is there a segregation between the racialized families and white families? Is there a way that we can bridge that gap and create perhaps a little bit more commingling there? What do the decorations look like? Queens hockey teams play at Memorial Rink here. There's a huge oil painting of the Queen. So everybody turns to the Queen for the anthems and things like that. It is offensively large. And this is one thing that the players noticed right off the bat. They're like, it's probably not the best thing to have in our rink. And they recently had a Q logo designed by an Indigenous graphic designer. They're like, hey, maybe we could hang a flag up of that as perhaps a better option than the Queen. What do you use the space for? Is it predominantly a hockey space? Is it a multi-use space where non-hockey families can come to the rink to do other activities? Have you ever had your hockey team in that space to learn about things that challenge the whiteness of the space or the dominant ideology of the space? I think it's Muffet McGraw, who was a NCAA basketball coach, and she has a trivia question for her players in order to end practice. They don't leave that court until they've answered the trivia question, which I think is a simple way to be like, you're not just athletes. We're using this space to create a different kind of citizen, and that the players know that that's an expectation of them. So I think that there are different activities we can do in the rink that foster anti-racism and different kinds of dominant ideologies. Brianne Jenner from our national team, she teaches hockey IQ sessions with minor hockey kids, and she asked me once to kind of help her put together a session about the Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes. So she conceptualized hockey IQ as not just strategy and on-ice decision, but how can we learn different histories about the sport? So how can we use a practice time or something like that to say, this is not just about hockey. We are trying to foster good character and citizens through the sport. So how can we use the rink differently to privilege different values and activities? And then the last one, language, which I said is, you know, kind of the dominant thing we do, but I think it contributes to what happens in the space and who is in that space. Are we still using the term midget instead of U16? I still hear that quite a bit. Do you use the term mohawk for open pivots? And it comes from a particular space that Indigenous folks were used as entertainment, brought to England to dance for British folks, and then coupled with the British fascination of cowboys and Indians at that time, they saw a resemblance in some of the spread eagle footwork and what they were doing on the ice. And so that's how the name Mohawk came, and it just has kind of stuck. But it's not a name that we need to be using anymore. I've been at hockey camps where folks just call it heel to heel, right? Like there are ways that we can get around that quite simply. So I think these are some examples of how we can put anti-racism work into creating a space with a particular set of values. If you get to design a space from scratch, even better. I think the Seattle Kraken are kind of a perfect example of that. But obviously there's far more opportunities for us to retrofit spaces with our values. So that's kind of what we're trying to look for here. So I'll close with asking you, not necessarily now in the chat, but as a takeaway, to really think about the values that are physically embedded into a rink and through the practices, and what you can identify as perhaps environmental microaggressions. So where are the things that you could actually change who is using that space, how they're using it, and this is one way that we can hopefully start ensuring that hockey really is for everyone. So I'll end it there and open it to questions, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for your talk. And yeah, does anyone have any questions? They can pop them into the Q&A or into the chat. Just pause for a minute. I have a question about that spreadsheet that you shared. Is there anything similar like that with respect to like arena names or hockey? Do you know what I mean? Or have we curated a list of something similar with respect to hockey as far as names that need to go?
There's nothing that I know of. Yeah, I feel like somebody in our collective would have seen it if that has happened, or one of us would have been creating it. But maybe that is something that we need to do. And I think the prevalence of it in rock climbing, I think it speaks to a generational change in the values, and really recognizing that that's a huge barrier, and specific to their sport. So maybe it's not necessarily the hugest issue in our sport. I think we've got a lot of issues in our sport, but it certainly could be part of it. And maybe that's one of the collective things that we do to kind of notice that maybe it's not as one-off as we think. Maybe there is more of a pattern.
For sure. And Daniel asked a question, have the organizations you've worked with been receptive to your space-based changes? That's a tongue twister, space-based changes.
It's a good question, Daniel. I think that it's generally, I think it's fairly new. So have organizations necessarily had the opportunity to do it? I've seen a little bit of it at the PWHPA. I think they have, going into the new league, they've taken some of what they've learned and been more intentional about how they've chosen the ranks that they're working with and things. But again, it is hard when we're retrofitting everything. There's limited opportunities. So I know that the Seattle Kraken, they have like a sensory quiet room for folks, which most arenas don't. So I think that kind of speaks to the ability of when you create a new space, what you can really do with it. And we are unfortunately quite limited. So maybe it is starting with names, starting with the decorations, the music, those more individual things that we can do. Because it is a very big undertaking that most of us don't have the power to change, but we can certainly advocate it, and bring certain things to people's attention.
Amy, sorry, Cheryl, Shannon, I'm going to the other folks first. Amy just asked a question, if you can speak to examples of policies, big P versus little p, as to how to implement some of these changes.
That's an interesting question, because spaces are so geographically contextual time contextual. I think it would be very hard to, like, I don't know of any policies that say you have to do. I mean, the best thing is probably like accessibility of new spaces, or that you have to make sure that aisles, can fit wheelchairs through them at stores and things like that. But even when I work at Sport Check, I know that we would just put merchandise where it fit and where we thought it would sell, and with zero consideration of people needing to get mobility devices through there. So I think actually maybe sometimes the policies do exist, but we ignore them. Yeah, I think that that's a very interesting question, Amy, and I would need to look more into it. But at this point, there is no policy. It is just very piecemeal, and it's good people wanting to make something different, because this really isn't on our radar as kind of like a wholesale thing that we need to think about.
Awesome, thanks. So now we'll get to Cheryl's question first. Oh, Cheryl's, never mind. We'll go to Shannon's. What sort of actions have resulted from people doing these audits from your experience?
Another good question, and something that I don't necessarily have an answer for this time, because again, this is very new stuff that we're trying to roll out. With Black Girl Hockey Club, this was part of a Get Uncomfortable campaign resource that we've been putting together. So a rink walk was definitely part of the thing that we wanted people to do. But again, it's like we put it out. I don't even know if it's available yet, but I thought it was out about a month ago. But the hope is that people will do them and share kind of what they have done and what they're trying to change. So yeah, we're not yet there yet to see the actual fruits of the labor. We're still kind of just educating folks that this is something that we should be aware of. But I think Soraya Tinker's dad also says in the Black Ice documentary, one of the first things he does when he goes to a new rink is looks at all the pictures to see what kind of a space he's in. So maybe we should just be starting with pictures. And how do we memorialize the past, but also usher in a new future and make sure that people feel that they're welcome. And I don't think that there's necessarily one single answer for how we do that in a community rink.
Awesome, thanks. So Taylor has another comment, and he says, thanks so much, Courtney. And then I'll read what he has here, or they have here. Drawing on a point you raised earlier, so many new facilities have been built are public-private partnerships, which results in large amounts of corporate sponsorships in their rink, including one in St. Catharines. So how best should one approach trying to implement these changes by approaching community organizations or the corporations?
Interesting question. And I wonder why it's an or and why not both. Because I think you kind of have to do both. Like the community organization is an easier approach, I think, because you're like, you are supposed to be serving the public. This is your demographic. These are supposed to be the values. And corporations, I think there is certainly a business slant to be like, you know what, let's bring in some different vendors in here. Let's get more butts in the seats. How can we, diversity, the market loves diversity. So kind of speak the speak, but really with more intention than they perhaps would understand is going into it, or with a bigger long-term perspective than they might care for. So I think it would be ideal if you have enough time and energy to go after both, especially when you're building a new space. Yeah, it's an interesting question, Taylor. Thank you.
Okay, and Name has a question, and Amy shared, I'll put it in the chat. Amy, thank you for sharing that. Control V is chat. Hockey Nova Scotia looks like they are addressing kind of the things that you're talking about. So
Awesome.
thank you for sharing that link, Amy. Name has a question here. First of all, thank you for this great webinar, and space themed again. I always walk into the local arena where my son's team practices, and I feel like I don't belong. There are very few non-racialized groups of people participating, and there's no representation of the local Indigenous community or any Indigenous people. There are hundreds of historic photos on the wall, historic in quotes, and very few, if any, Indigenous people seen on them. Are you aware of any work being done by hockey associations or larger athletic bodies that direct hockey associations on the importance of representation in these spaces? Do you think that that kind of work should be done locally? Because there is a ton of erasure.
So no, I don't know of any work being done kind of in a broader scale. I think where we're at with hockey culture is that representation is talking about people and it's talking about players specifically, and not looking at team staff, medical staff, the labor that goes in around an arena and things like that. So I think it definitely can be done locally. I've also had questions from students about like, how do we make sure it's not tokenistic? How do we make sure that the one Black person on the team is not plastered all over the rink to be like, look how diverse we are? And I think that that's a conversation that a local community would need to have. Like, what is the purpose of the image? What are the images that we're using? What would you like to see in this space? So one of the things that we had done with I'm forgetting my own museum exhibit name. Does anybody know? It's the Punjabi hockey exhibit that we'd done with the Sikh Heritage Museum to kind of tell a more racialized history of hockey contributions. Is that's, it's traveling and it's drawing on local people to be like, not just high level players, but these are the families and players that also want to be part of that space. So I think there is a way to create kind of a living DIY museum. I don't know if museum is perhaps the best word, but like a cultural representation of what the space is now and where we would like it to go. And I think there's a lot of creativity there. And I think even kids' artwork and stuff like that is really fun to see. And they have got really good visions of what life should be like in utopic societies. So yeah, on the grand scale, unfortunately, we're not having those conversations. But I think at the local level, there's so much possibility that can be done, particularly through the youth. And what representation looks like. We could do revolving land acknowledgements as like something that is perhaps physically taking up space. And I know land acknowledgements are far from perfect, but I think it is one thing that can remind folks. And if it's something that we're changing season to season, at very least with the team coming up with the land acknowledgement, I think that could be part of the work that goes into it. So the land acknowledgements that I use for my course syllabi are created by my third year class. So they kind of do individual ones, and then I pull together the best parts of all of them so that there's a collective land acknowledgement that goes forward to the next year. So I think some like getting players to do part of that work is small steps that we can get to people to think about that space differently and what their legacy might be. Which is kind of a colonial term, so let's not use legacy, but their contribution in that space.
Awesome. So I just had one, maybe it'll be a final question unless someone else has one. I think about the contradiction and like you talked about the tokenism, but I wonder about how, I don't know how this is phrased, but the Edmonton Oilers, for example, are very open about celebrating Pride nights, and they have Indigenous representation with the land acknowledgement before the games. They have the jerseys and all of that. But at the same time, they've launched a lawsuit against Boyle Street, which is their neighbor, right? Because they want the parking lot space. And so, I just wonder, I don't know, can you just, I don't really have a question, but what's your thought, but just what's your thoughts on that paradox, like, are the Oilers actually doing good things by diversifying the space, but at the same time, the owners are suing the unhoused people beside them, most of which are Indigenous? I don't know, just what are your sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a perfect example of the limits of us doing Pride nights and any kind of commemorative thing that is a one-off, flash in the pan, comes with some merchandise that you can sell. I think the reality is that the work, that is the deep labor, you can't buy it. Right? There's not a commodity that comes with it. And to have that conversation with a private entity like an NHL team is a real uphill battle. I will say that there are organizations that seem like they're doing good things on the back end that we'll never see, and that's probably the way it should be. Like, I'll give you an example, is that a couple years ago, the Toronto Maple Leafs asked me to do a Zoom for Asian Heritage Month. And they had asked me my fee, and I gave them my fee. I was like, I'm doing a half an hour on Zoom, doesn't have to be much. And they're like, cool. And then a couple weeks later, they're like, you know, we're gonna bump you up to match the other speakers. I would have never known. And those are the things that, like, I think really speak to something is actually going right in that organization, because I would have not known, that nobody else would have known. They could have gotten away with it. But, you know, a couple $100 is not much to the Leafs, but it did say that their priorities seem to be in the right place. So those are the things that, again, it's no photo op that goes with it. There's no press that goes with it. So I think it is a long haul, and we can only kind of judge people over a longer span of time, as opposed to like this one event that they hosted. But yeah, I think that's a perfect example of like the sport loving diversity, but reproducing settler colonialism. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, and I think Cheryl said something similar in the chat. So we only have a couple minutes, so just if anyone has any final questions, now is your chance. But Courtney, thank you so much for your expertise and for this talk. It really was super informative. Thank you so much for everything.
Thanks for having me, folks.